A Bitter Taste by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 11. Hannibal left him to sleep it off, and Will drifted in that in-between place where the waking world merged with sleep. The sound of the shower drifted to his ears like the pattering of rain the night he'd gone home again. Half asleep, Will found himself there once more, the scent of his cigar leading him through the shadows of his family home to find his father. It seemed important that he find him, important to tell him something. An apology? A plea for forgiveness? I left them. Why did I leave them? There was no stag there with him, no dangerous presence outside of his own. He wasn't sure if he'd met the ravenstag yet. The timeline of his life crossed itself, confusing him.
William, I don't want you traipsing around in the woods from now on,
Father said, stern and humorless at the dinner table, where they all sat rigidly in their chairs, scrubbed rosy and clean, and dressed in their best. Is it because of the body? Father's face darkened, his blue eyes cutting to Mary in annoyed warning. His little sister's name was Mary, and he nearly sobbed in relief to know it.
This is not appropriate conversation for the dinner table, William. Just do as I say, for your own sake.
Mary, Will murmured, shifting in the bed enough to make the moment subside. Hannibal was gone, just a faint trace of his aftershave lingering in the room. Will reluctantly rolled out of the bed and did his best to tend to the rumpled bedding, but there was really no rescuing it after their one-on-one session this morning. He opted instead to strip it all off and pile it on the floor before going in for a shower himself. By the time he got downstairs again, barefoot as he preferred, his dark jeans rather longer than he'd anticipated and still stiff, his shirt negligently buttoned and untucked. It was mid-morning, but still gloomy in Hannibal's house. He seemed to prefer it to have atmosphere, a combination of furnishings, wall colors, decor conspiring to leave the house elegantly museum-like and hushed.
Would you explain this?
Will picked up the half-shrieked comment and headed towards Hannibal's office, curious. For a second there it had sounded like, "Well?" Without a doubt, Matilda was back again, this time with a bone to pick. Will quietly cracked the door to Hannibal's office to find her once more before his desk, hands on her narrow hips. Hannibal was holding something card-sized, perhaps a photograph, consternation written in the frown on his handsome face.
"What do you wish me to tell you, Matilda?"
he finally asked, his mild calm only seeming to infuriate her further.
"I want you to tell me how it's possible!" she ordered, hooking her finger around the item in question to point something out. "This photo was taken 40 years ago, Hannibal. Explain to me how this can even be!"
"I have no obvious explanation for you,"
Hannibal murmured, his brown eyes boring into hers.
"What explanation do you have for yourself?"
She threw her hands up in aggravation, swinging away to pace nervously, heels clicking loudly in sudden silence. Finally she managed to say, "There isn't one." She approached the desk again, almost imploring when she said, "There isn't one, is there? There is just no possible, feasible way to explain this!" Hannibal's full mouth pursed slightly, and he tipped the photo toward his chest, bending it into a slight curve.
"Do you have copies of this photograph, Matilda?"
She laughed harshly, nodding.
"Of course I do, Hannibal. It was my sister's wedding, for God's sakes. There's any number of photographs just like this one."
"Is there any way I could persuade you to keep this to yourself?"
Hannibal asked her, his tone silky.
"What if I don't?"
she asked, her chin tipped up at a haughty angle, her thin frame tight with tension.
What if I tell the whole wide world, Hannibal? What happens then?"
Hannibal's slight, delighted smile curved his lips then. With barely hidden delight, he told her,
"You would be ostracized from your social circles for your ridiculous accusations, and find yourself quite alone and quite vulnerable."
She swallowed hard, the noise audible even to Will, who stayed hidden behind the door panel, watching it all play out.
"Exactly," she conceded. "I didn't come here to make threats, Hannibal. I came here for answers because my mind is having difficulty accepting what my eyes are seeing."
"That is profoundly unsettling."
Hannibal purred, taking the photograph and sliding it into an envelope before putting it into his desk drawer. Will heard the click of a lock falling into place, and wondered who he was hiding it from.
Should you like to discuss it further, I would be happy to accommodate a future session for you, Matilda. Sadly, I have an appointment very shortly, and would appreciate it if you could use the other door when leaving.
She did so, her face red with frustration, every step clipped and sharp. She was too well-mannered to slam the door behind her, but it closed with a decisively intentional click, a subtle display of displeasure.
"Hannibal?"
Will asked, letting himself into the room in her wake.
"What was that all about?"
Hannibal discreetly slipped the key to his desk into his jacket pocket, and greeted Will with a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
"Matilda was taken with nostalgia and was reviewing her old photographs,"
he said, striding smartly around his desk to straighten a few volumes of books that dared to be out of place.
"She found one that just happened to capture someone who should not have been there, then nor now, without changing it all."
Will's brows rose, and a soft, "Oh," escaped him before he could stop it.
"She did say she recognized me,"
he mused, drifting to a stop behind one of the chairs. He braced his hands there, fingers curling on the back of it, his thoughts reorganizing.
"I guess she did. I think you should revisit Matilda, Will,"
Hannibal said, things organized to his satisfaction. He crossed the short distance to lay his hand on Will's shoulder, warmly squeezing. He had a tendency to press just slightly into the personal space of whoever he was granting his attention to, Will had discovered. Just enough to make it feel more intimate than it actually was. Just enough to bring awareness to him in a way that might distract, make one susceptible to his suggestions. Even realizing it was no guard against it. Will still felt his nearness acutely and thrilled with it, treasuring each moment he felt so shockingly alive.
"She'll be frightened of me,"
Will murmured, turning his head just a little, countering with his own carefully constructed manipulations, giving Hannibal an unhindered view of his round cheek, the plumpness of his lower lip, the fan of his dark lashes shielding his gaze. Hannibal smiled, his hand moving to Will's far shoulder as he stepped closer, tipping Will's head up and turning it toward him.
"She won't be. She has a compulsive need to save people, Will. She couldn't save her husband from anxiety and bad decisions. She couldn't save her son from drugs and overindulgence. She will want to save you, her ageless beauty, the one precious thing she has left."
Will frowned. He'd taken Matilda off of his menu when he had decided to stay here, in Hannibal's home. He hadn't counted on her digging into her past and finding evidence of having met him before, 40 years ago, when she'd been a silly young thing, full of flirty laughter and excitement for her future. He suddenly and vehemently did not want to kill her. She'd had enough disappointment so far that even her wealth and position couldn't make up for it. He didn't want to be yet another.
"Will?"
Hannibal purred, his hand caressing Will's jaw, stroking up his temple into his still damp curls. He realized what he was seeing and pressed.
"Leaving her to live out the rest of her natural lifespan ceased being an option the moment she found that photograph."
"I know that," Will said, wetting his lips with the tip of his tongue.
"And I expect you know what's to be done about it,"
Hannibal said, stepping away from him entirely, his goal achieved. It rankled Will, annoyed him almost to the point of rebellion. Hannibal's manipulation was obvious to him, as his own manipulations were obvious to Hannibal, but that didn't make them any less effective or frustrating, especially when he had no qualms letting Will see how easy it was for him. Even spending a few hours tied into a tight knot of flesh and delightful pleasure barely registered on the grand scale that was Hannibal Lecter.
"If you'll excuse me, Will, I need you to lock that door behind you, please,"
Hannibal instructed him, readying himself for his appointment.
"Anything you want me to get for you while I'm out?"
Will asked, a mocking smile curling his lips when he said it.
"I'll leave that to your best judgment, Will,"
Hannibal said, sparing him a glance and a sharp smile of his own.
"Try not to be too bored today."
Will retreated, closing and locking the door in his wake, a true grin spreading over his face. In all the many lonely years of his timeless existence, he never dreamed he'd meet anyone as unusual, frustrating, and compelling as Hannibal Lecter, even if he was a manipulative, emotionless bastard.
I wonder if I can get that out of him,
Will mused, laying plans for Matilda's farewell.
I wonder if either one of us can manage to get that out of each other.
It would amuse him to try, he knew, and that was all the incentive he really needed. Will knew Matilda's routine by now. When she met her girlfriends, where she went for dinner, book club, bridge, whatever struck her fancy. He knew more about Matilda than he knew about anyone, thanks to having lived with her for a week, something he'd only done but rarely in the course of his life as a predator. He knew that, barring incident, she'd be swimming laps in her warm indoor pool when he sneaked back into her property, swimming back and forth, chasing her fading youth with determination and desperation. But she'd found a damned photo. She'd remembered him 40 years after having met him once before, which surprised Will. He never thought he was that interesting. He never thought he was as beautiful as they seemed to think, merely acceptable. So much emphasis on looks, laughably so when a person's appearance was the one thing about them guaranteed to change. Everyone except Will. Forever on the cusp of full adulthood, trapped forever in a man's body with a boy's softness clinging to its edges. "William?" He unfolded from the bench where he'd been sitting, waiting for her to finish her lap and make the return. She held on to the edge of the pool and gazed at him, bewildered but not afraid.
"Matilda,"
he softly said in response, taking slow, unthreatening steps toward her.
"Would you come out, please?"
"Of course," she said, her smile unfeigned. He offered his hand and she took it, allowing him to lift her from the water with effortless ease. "I didn't expect to see you."
"Didn't you?"
he asked, steadying her. She was so much smaller than him without the armor of her clothing and painfully high heels. "I thought Hannibal would entertain you well enough," she said, letting go of his hand and plucking her towel up to dry her face. She seemed cagey suddenly, oddly disconcerted by the subject she herself had brought up. Out of nowhere, she said, "You should be careful of him, William. I don't know if you're entirely safe."
"I know,"
he said, offering her a soft, sad smile.
"He told me about the photograph."
Her gaze flew up to his, startled and surprised. What did you say to him? I thought I was going crazy when I saw it." Will gave a gentle shake of his head, murmuring,
"Nah, not crazy, Matilda. Just inconvenient."
"What?" He smelled her fear, sudden and sharp, could hear the pace of her heart jump higher.
"Matilda,"
he said, advancing on her. She took a step backward in response, clutching her towel to her chest as if it might protect her somehow.
"I want you to know that I'm sorry."
"Sorry for what, William?" she asked, the tremor in her voice betraying her fear.
"I'm sorry that I couldn't have left you in a better place than where I found you,"
he breathed, reaching out to cup her face in his hands, her skin cool from the water, the stench of chlorine overriding the remnants of her expensive perfume.
"I'm sorry that I had to return to you this way and end it all."
"William!" She saw his teeth descending. He could see his reflection in her dark eyes, how they widened as those sharp, lupine teeth were revealed.
"What do you want most in the world, Matilda?"
Will asked her, feeling it swelling from him, reaching for her, snaring her in her own desires.
"Name me that thing."
She trembled, tears streamed down her cheeks. Breathlessly, she mewed, "You! I want you! I want you!" Will lay in the midst of a warm, rumpled bed, the scent of heat and sex clinging to his skin. A man was there at his side, the ravenstag unmasked, the shadow of antlers clinging to his head. Firelight played over his face, but Will couldn't see it, wasn't ready to see it. It was enough to feel those questing fingers on his skin, trails of fire down a body ripe for pleasure. He was shameless in his display, delighted in the delight taken in him, for once in his life a beautiful, priceless treasure, instead of a broken, bewildering anomaly.
"What do you want most in the world, Will?"
the ravenstag asked, kissing his palms one after the other, sharp teeth prickling his skin.
"Name me that thing."
"You," Will told him, opening himself wide for utter possession, a willing vessel waiting to be filled in whatever way the ravenstag chose to suit itself. "I want you." Will staggered back, skittering backwards in a surprise. Matilda floated face down in her pool, a haze of blood drifting out from her head. There was a bloody stain on the side of the diving board where her temple had struck hard. Will had a vague understanding that he'd flung her from him, her death accidental in his surprise. He brought his hand to his mouth and bit down on it, hard, the only way he could think of to pen up the urge to scream. Of all the people he would see die pointlessly, Matilda was the last. He'd come here with his gift at the ready, and ended up giving her a paltry, common end, painful and frightening and stupidly inept. "I'm sorry," he moaned, reining himself into a semblance of control. He cast one last regretful look at her empty shell, and silently fled the way he'd come in, unnoticed and unknown.
"Are you just going to stare at me, Dr. Lecter, or do you have something to say?"
Will asked, glowering at the man seated across from him. They were settled comfortably in Hannibal's small study, seated before the fire with drinks in hand. Hannibal took a sip of his liquor and considered him, his critical eyes noting Will's hunched posture and tight, tense face.
"Things did not go as planned,"
Hannibal observed, turning his glass in his long fingers.
"What happened, Will?"
Will threw himself back into the seat, his drink sloshing over his hand unheeded, his eyes upraised to search the ceiling like it might have answers for him. He slapped his other hand over his eyes and took a deep breath, blowing it out with frustration.
"Will?"
"It didn't work," he said, angry at himself, angry at Hannibal for sending him after her.
"It didn't fucking work." "Language, please,"
Hannibal murmured. Whatever his preference in the bedroom, he was consistently insistent outside of it.
"What didn't work, Will? Tell me what has you so disturbed."
"I went there. I waited," Will explained, pausing to gather his thoughts, trying to find words to explain. "I had her, Hannibal. I had her right there in my hands. I asked her my question and—" Hannibal cocked his head, watching him struggle, using that, too, to feed his insatiable appetite for the world around him.
"She said you,"
Will whispered, laughing harshly. He raked his free hand through his hair, setting his curls into disarray.
"She said what she wanted most in the world was me."
Hannibal's brows rose, clearly not expecting that any more than Will had.
"So you found yourself unable to grant it to her?"
"No," Will said, shaking his head. No, that was my answer, Hannibal. Mine!" Hannibal merely waited, expecting him to explain. "When the ravenstag asked me what I wanted most in the world, asked me to name it," Will whispered, trembling with the memory. "That was my answer to him. You." Hannibal put his glass down and leaned forward, effortlessly elegant as he rescued Will's glass in turn, placing it carefully on the small side table next to him. He leaned his elbows on his spread knees and steepled his fingers over his mouth, considering.
"She jostled loose a memory,"
he said, more to himself than to Will.
"And you reacted without thinking."
"I don't know what I did," Will admitted, laughing at his own failure. "God, I have no idea. I was there in the room with the ravenstag 1 second, and then next Matilda was floating in her own pool."
"Did you drown her, Will?"
No, I think I threw her. Or maybe I just cracked her head against the diving board on purpose," he said, the words bitter.
"She sparked a memory, and I made her pay for it."
Hannibal nodded softly, frowning. "It wasn't what I wanted for her," Will said, his anger ebbing away to sorrow.
"Why is it not what you wanted for her?"
Hannibal inquired, watching him carefully.
"Matilda was nothing to you, Will. Had you not been distracted by me, she would have met with the same fate as your other victims."
"Victims?" Will echoed, a laugh startled out of him. His blue eyes darkened when he searched Hannibal's face, a slight, mystified smile on his lips. "You choose your words so carefully to suit your purpose, Dr. Lecter. My conquests become victims, but are sometimes merely prey, depending on your intentions." Hannibal smiled at him, pleased.
"You are far too intelligent to be influenced by such, Will. But tell me, why does Matilda's death upset you?"
"Because it was mine to give her the way I wanted to! I wanted to give her that gift, Hannibal. I wanted to let her go with some semblance of—"
"Dignity?"
Hannibal offered, flustering him.
"Yeah,
Will said, frowning because despite his doubts, Hannibal had been right in naming his methods as he had.
Something better than drowning. She looked so common that way. It wasn't right for her. All humans die, Will, one way or another,
Hannibal reminded him.
Some go in grandiose ways, others slip away silently. Death is not always a reflection of the life lived, Will. Sometimes it is merely a death.
Will shifted in his chair, sullen. It had been a very long time since it had bothered him to this extent.
Or is it simply that without your gift, without taking their lives in such a way, you commit mere murder instead of artistry?
Will glared at him, irritated.
Murder has its advantages too,
Hannibal said, settling back and crossing his legs, idly tracing the crease in his pant leg with thumb and forefinger.
Through murder, you can give a life meaning that a death, by accident or age, cannot provide. Murder can be a gift too, Will. Would you like to see?
Will blinked, suddenly alert.
Are you offering to take me with you, Dr. Lecter?
He ventured, curious. Hannibal's eyes were somber and weighty when they met his own, searching him for signs of hesitation or reluctance.
I would like to take you for a certain purpose, Will. Yes,
he said, skirting the issue.
What happens will be up to you. Because I always have a choice?
Will asked, almost mockingly. Hannibal was too well-mannered to rise to the bait. Instead, he gave Will a smile that was predatory with anticipation, and purred.
Oh, you do have a choice, Will. You always have.
Hannibal drove him out of the city that night. There was a fire in his eyes that matched what Will had seen in his bed, though it stemmed from another place entirely. Hannibal's passions, it seemed, presented the same to even Will's discerning eye.
Do you have something specific in mind, or are we just going?
Will asked, lolling in the passenger seat of Hannibal's ridiculously luxurious car.
I always have something in mind,
he answered, angling an amused glance at Will.
Considering how Matilda's death affected you, it occurs to me that you aren't utilizing your talents to the fullest, Will. When I asked you if it bothers you, you said no. Was that a lie? No?
Will said, turning to look out at the passing scenery. They were reaching a less populated area, passing less return traffic.
It wasn't a lie, and no, it doesn't bother me, per se. Every death since then is a weight around my neck.
Hannibal echoed back at him, amused.
They aren't irreconcilable,
Will said, his fingers spreading out on the warm leather seat, exploring the texture with his sensitive fingertips.
I carry their weight so it isn't meaningless, but that doesn't stop me from doing it all over again. You deceive yourself,
Hannibal decided. I compartmentalize, Will corrected him, smiling a little.
Time hasn't taught me patience, Dr. Lecter, but it has taught me pragmatism. Pragmatism has its value,
Hannibal agreed, turning off on a side road.
But now I would like to see something else. What's that?
Will asked, wary now. The Bentley tires crunched on gravel as Hannibal maneuvered it onto what was little more than a dirt path.
Your participation,
Hannibal said, shutting the car off and pocketing the keys. They sat in the sudden silence, broken only by the soft click of the engine cooling.
Participation, Dr. Lecter?
Will asked, his voice a study in neutrality.
Is this an attempt to show me how murder can be meaningful? I want you to hunt for me, again,
Hannibal said, his hooded eyes gleaming in the faint light.
Not as an angel of mercy, but one of vengeance. Avenging what, may I ask?
Hannibal's brows rose.
Does it matter? I asked you to hunt for me, and you said yes. There is nothing more to be said.
I want what you tell me to want when you tell me to want it? Will asked, his voice silky. Hannibal's eyes fastened on his mouth.
Yes.
Will sighed a little, knowing the way his mouth parted brought other things to mind, just a small reminder of his own appeal. He found himself wanting to remind Hannibal of that, now that they were out in the middle of nowhere with murder hanging between them. He very much wanted Hannibal Lecter to remember what had transpired in his bed, and hope for another chance at that. It was as good as a way as any to stay alive and entertained, and he was in a damn terrible mood from Matilda's death, that was for sure.
Down this trail there are 4 cabins,
Hannibal said, pulling his gaze from Will's mouth with gratifying reluctance.
In the last cabin on the left, there is a man drinking his last drink on earth.
He turned and looked at Will again, sober, all thoughts of sex set aside in favor of intensity.
There's a case in the back seat. Get it, please.
Will frowned slightly, but did as he was bidden, sliding out into the warm night air to retrieve Hannibal's bag. Hannibal himself was ill-dressed for this area, still in his expensive suit and gleaming Italian shoes. If he was concerned about it, he certainly hid it well. Will wordlessly handed him the bag, walking alongside him through the thick brush in the darkness. There wasn't a soul around, no whispers of small animals in the night, just the rustle of trees as the wind sighed through it.
It's like the night I snuck out,
Will thought, smiling a little to himself with the remembered ease of that moment. His smile faded, however, when he thought of the would-be robber lying bleeding on the ground, with the ravenstag rearing over him.
How'd you know he'd be here?
Will asked, seeing the cabins beyond the trees.
Social media is a curious thing,
Hannibal said, angling toward the last cabin.
Enabling one to follow another's actions with ease. I find it quite easy to track whomever I wish to find. How do you choose them, Hannibal? Considering what I would wish to remove from this world, that is how I choose them.
Will laughed softly, shaking his head.
Outright rudeness, lack of manners in general, anything that offends your aesthetics. There are very few requirements to find oneself on a very long list,
Hannibal told him, amused.
I take them as the mood strikes me, or as my requirements dictate. The world's a massive larder,
Will mused, finding it rather lovely.
The hunter's hunter, as you are, Will,
Hannibal reminded him, pausing behind the chosen cabin to hang the bag by one strap on a stubby tree limb. He unzipped it and pulled out a peculiar thing. Will thought it was a hazmat suit at first, then realized it lacked a hood or face guard. He watched with curiosity as Hannibal pulled it on over his clothing, shoes and all, zipping it up with ease to encase himself in slick plastic.
You're careless with your kills, Will,
Hannibal told him, tugging and pulling the suit to his satisfaction.
You've been lucky so far, but you won't always be.
I don't exist, Will said, stepping back to get a better look at him.
They can't pin a murder on a ghost. There are no ghosts in this day and age,
Hannibal said, zipping the case neatly and taking it in hand.
Cameras abound, evidence lies dormant in custody, pictures are taken and shared. The world has grown smaller in your lifetime, Will. You either change as it requires, or you find yourself its victim at long last. Which do you prefer?
Will gave him a dubious once-over.
I prefer not wearing something like that.
Hannibal tipped his nose up almost imperceptibly, enough so that Will thought he might have managed to actually offend him, which might have taken him off of the short list of people not to eat and landed him on the long list of entrees in waiting.
I couldn't carry it off like you do,
he amended, the obvious play getting a frown from Hannibal's pursed lips, but nothing more. When Hannibal headed purposefully toward the rear steps of the cabin, Will followed in his wake. He wondered what Hannibal had in mind, what he'd do if more than just his chosen victim was inside. He wondered how many people at a time the man before him had killed, and hoped to ask him that very question on the long ride home. The back door was unlocked, no doubt from neglect. The remnants of a fire smoked in the fire pit, the glowing embers dying down to coals. Beer cans littered the ground around a single chair. So, all alone then.
Will,
Hannibal said, opening the door for him. Cigarette smoke drifted out onto the night air along with the sour stench of booze. He could hear a radio host giving the play-by-play of a baseball game, and was seized by the sudden desire to see one himself, just to see what the fuss was about.
God damn it, you losers!
The loud voice slurred, full of irrational anger. Will moved through the small kitchen into the main room proper, not impressed by the irate, unkempt man flopped into the sprung recliner. Will had no doubt the cabin had started out quite nice by the look of it, a rental space meant for cautious suburbanites to come experience the great outdoors without too much inconvenience. He had no idea how long this man had been in possession of this place, but he'd been careless with it, if not deliberately destructive.
Who the fuck are you?
The man asked, becoming aware of the pale, silent shadow that darkened his doorway. Will frowned softly, looking him over with scrutinizing eyes. The man was a blight on good company, a thorn in the side of society. With his unwashed hair, 3-day stubble, and beady eyes, he seemed more a parasite to Will than a human being.
This is how he sees them, he thought, taking a smooth, even step toward the man glowering at him. They're no more fit to breathe the air he breathes than a cockroach or a maggot. I said, I heard you, Will murmured, cocking his head as if a new angle might reveal some redeeming quality in this waste of air and space. He thought of Matilda, her head cracked open like a walnut and left to drown. She was gone. This bag of bile remained. Then fucking answer me, asshole, the man said, gesturing at him with a hand holding a cigarette, the other clenched on the neck of a beer bottle. Fucking kids is doing whatever they want. Didn't your mama tell you it's rude to just walk into places that don't belong to you? Didn't your mother tell you? Will asked, closer and closer, genuine annoyance coloring his mild words. That it's rude to destroy things that don't belong to you. What? The man asked, laughing, exasperated. He stood from the chair and ground out his cigarette with a mean, anticipatory grin on his face. He wasn't drunk enough by far to be ineffective, and lunged at Will with the intention to land a punch from his swinging arm. Will easily sidestepped, graceful and alert. He'd fought over the long decades of his life, less so to hunt than to defend himself or stop something he considered unjust. It was muscle memory by now to do so, to duck and slide out of the way, amused as the man became more and more enraged by his elusiveness. Son of a bitch! The man snarled, choosing to sling the bottle at Will. It smashed hard on the wall, foamy beer leaving a pungent stain that dripped down the wood. His bloodshot eyes were wild with fury, his yellow teeth clenched as hard as his fists. Will laughed at his paltry anger, at his easy rage. He had no idea what it was like to be truly angry, truly enraged. He had no idea what injustice actually was, damn him, and yet here he was, acting as if a stranger in his home was worthy of such a ridiculous display of aggression. What the fuck are you laughing at? Will bit his lip, but the laughter wouldn't be restrained. You. Will, Hannibal said from the kitchen doorway, making the man spin around in alarm. Are you done playing with your food? The man turned again, alarm rising to replace the anger finally. Finally he began to see what mortal danger he was in, how ineffective and insufficient his blind and stupid reach for anger was. You, Will murmured, catching the acrid scent of his fear. Brought this on yourself. Hey, man, no harm, no foul, the man said, suddenly conciliatory in the face of the odds. Just, go, okay? No worries. Oh? Will inquired, smirking. Brave enough when it's just a fucking kid. But 2-on-1 is a whole other ballgame, isn't it? Hannibal looked on, his cruel curiosity obvious in his dark eyes. Remember what I said to you, Will? How murder can grant meaning to a life. I remember, Will said, finding it difficult to view this moment from any perspective other than Hannibal's. He looked at the human before him and saw nothing more than a spot to be cleared away. Is this life worth your dignity? Hannibal pressed, pushing him. Or would such a gift be wasted on something so base? Will didn't doubt that if he bothered to untangle himself from Hannibal's intentions, he might be able to find something redeemable in the man growing ever more agitated before him. He had no desire, however, to do so. There was a cold, sharp elegance to Hannibal's view of the world, a kind of elemental balancing of the scales that appealed to Will's latent morality. It should have frightened him at long last, but it didn't. It just didn't. The man laughed nervously, his gaze darting from the slim young man on one side to the strangely dressed man on the other. He opened his mouth to say something. He never got the chance. Whatever plea or curse he intended, whatever placatory excuse he was going to offer died a sudden, shocked death when Will sank his fingers into the man's throat, twisted and ripped a handful of flesh free, whispering, I don't want to hear it. Whatever you have to say is meaningless to me. Blood sprayed everywhere, coating him in wet heat. Awful bubbling, gurgling noises rose from the man's chest, his lungs no longer in contact with the rest of him, his airway torn open to plain view. No gift, no solace granted. No question to give notice that death was incoming, no dignity, and certainly no grace.
It was a quick and ugly death to match a quick and ugly life, and Will could see the beauty in it for as long as he looked through Hannibal's eyes. The man fell to his knees, hands scrabbling, flinging blood all over them. It sprayed onto Hannibal's plastic suit with the sound of raindrops on an awning, a dull pattering sound. It soaked into Will's clothing, a heat that quickly cooled. They watched him there together, watched him heaving and bleeding, eyes rolling wildly and mouth agape, trying to draw breath through the broken mess of his windpipe. Will could see the question there in his panicked eyes, the desperate, final question they all asked. Why me?
You were rude,
he murmured, grasping the man by his greasy hair, wrenching his head around with a crunching crack, and the body gave a convulsive jerk. When Will released his hold, it slumped to the worn wooden floor, twitching as nerve endings triggered. Will knelt next to the body and looked up at Hannibal, who gazed down at him with fierce, unabashed joy. For just a moment, Will wondered how on earth something like this could inspire the kind of unfettered glee he saw on Hannibal's face, but only for a moment. It was too easy to understand why, too easy to see how snuffing out this man's life like a candle was a source of power and pride. No more cursing, no more filth and rudeness, no more callous disregard for things he had no hand in creating or ownership of. He removed a source of intolerable ugliness from the world, like swatting a fly that buzzed around one's carefully prepared feast.
Was that to your satisfaction, Dr. Lecter?
Will softly asked, feeling that fine mist of blood drying tight on his face, the heavier droplets wet and clinging.
Oh, yes,
Hannibal said, reaching out with a plastic-encased hand to smooth Will's bloody curls back from his forehead.
Far in excess of, in fact. Tell me, Will, is this death another weight?
I want you.
Will blinked, tongue darting to lap a rivulet of blood that pooled in the corner of his mouth. In slow, measured tones, he said,
No, Dr. Lecter. At least, no more a weight than it would be for you. Then shall we continue?
Hannibal asked, turning his attention to the silent, still body. Will followed his gaze and murmured,
Yes.
The body was split open, the particular pieces removed, and packed in wax paper and plastic. Hannibal did his own butchering, having Will turn and move the body as he required for the removal of select pieces. Each one found a temporary home in wrappings, sealed into plastic and stacked into the bag atop Hannibal's spare tools for the walk back to the car. Will watched the process with a detachment that sent fluttering fingers of warning through him, fearfully trying to tell him that this was wrong, that nothing deserved this kind of disregard, that the last thing he'd seen gutted this way was a deer, and he'd vomited all over his own boots to the sound of his father's embarrassed scolding. He thought of Matilda and all the others who had succumbed to his charm, how the wounds he'd made were growing larger and more violent, and he wondered if he would eventually come to this very same method in the centuries to come.
It amuses me to display the bodies,
Hannibal said, zipping the bag up again over what he wanted to take with him.
In this case, however, time is of the essence.
He cocked his noble head at the mess on the floor, the pooled blood and piles of discarded flesh. It was human litter, detritus of fat and bone. It seemed to please Hannibal, enough so that he didn't feel it necessary to do much more than arrange the head suitably atop the mound of his own soft tissues, a figurative mess made literal. Will could feel the blood drying on him, sticky and uncomfortable. He eyed Hannibal's plastic suit with envy, even if it must be hot as hell. Hannibal felt his heavy gaze, realized the cause, and smirked, triumphant.
You're quite a mess,
he observed, standing and gathering his bag up.
Usually how it works out,
Will conceded, straightening beside him. Hannibal headed back the way they'd come, the bare dirt of the backyard giving way to meadow grass and dense underbrush. They moved through the heavy woods, angling back toward the dirt trail. When it thinned out enough, Hannibal paused and removed his plastic suit, turning it inside out as he did so.
You'll need to change clothes when we reach the car, Will,
he said, relaxed and conversational now, some part of him at ease to know that someone who had offended him somehow had paid for it with their life.
Didn't bring any, so I brought clothing for you,
Hannibal told him, moving more confidently now, his stride picking up pace.
And while we're on the subject of your clothing, Will, I must confess that I would prefer to dress you from now on."
"What?" Will asked, a disbelieving laugh burbling out of him.
"You mean—" "I mean what you've purchased is atrocious, and doesn't suit you in the least,"
Hannibal said, giving him a firm look.
"I intend to remedy that." "Clothes are clothes, Dr. Lecter,"
Will reminded him, moving around to the trunk when the man opened it. He peeled off his wet shirt even as he worked his boots off, the dirt clinging to the bottom of his socks.
"No, Will, your clothes are merely clothes,"
Hannibal corrected him, sorting the packets carefully into separate prepared coolers while Will stripped.
"Your ravenstag did you a favor taking you when he did. You're a perfect specimen of youth, Ganymede, yet you waste it by dressing like someone's grandfather."
Will snorted with laughter, dragging his socks off to feel the warm dirt beneath his toes. If he was going to get naked, he may as well be barefoot in the process.
"Grandfather!"
Hannibal silently offered a bag for Will to throw his clothes in. It didn't escape Will's notice that it was a garbage sack.
"Those as well,"
Hannibal said, nodding towards Will's jeans.
"All of it, in fact, please, Will. I can't have you getting blood inside my car. Stains are so difficult to get out of leather." "Of course they are,"
Will said, smirking as he worked his jeans off. They were stiff with blood and clung wetly to him, leaving streaks on his pale skin. Hannibal didn't acknowledge the remark, merely handed Will a pile of neatly folded clothing and watched him dress before telling him,
"Get into the car, please."
Will handed Hannibal his boots and got back into the passenger seat, careful not to put his head back. Most of the blood in his hair had dried, but he didn't want to take any chances considering his track record with Hannibal's things. He saw the man in the side mirror carefully brushing away the tracks Will's bare feet had made in the sandy dirt, as well as the prints his own dress shoes had made. When he got into the car, Will asked,
"Think anyone would see it anyway? One can never be too careful,"
Hannibal said, fishing his keys out and turning the car on. He tossed something at Will that turned out to be a knitted cap, saying,
"Put that on."
Will did so, not arguing, glad to have something between him and the headrest so he could lean back.
"How many have you ever killed at a time?"
he murmured, lids lowering almost closed as Hannibal carefully backed the Bentley out onto the little-used lane, headlights off.
"7,"
Hannibal said, no hesitation.
"I found myself cornered." "And they found themselves dead,"
Will said and grinned, opening his eyes to look at the man across from him.
"You live a very dangerous life for a human, Dr. Lecter." "I suppose I do,"
Hannibal said, a smile curling his perfect lips. There was a strange, amused glint in his eye when he looked at Will, adding,
"For a human."
Will laughed at that, his sharp teeth carelessly exposed.
"Have you remembered anything more, Will?"
Hannibal asked him, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, a perfect topic of conversation to have when one was driving home with body parts wrapped and packed in ice and a bag filled with dismembering tools rattling around in the trunk.
"Will?" "No, not really,"
he said, stifling the urge to laugh at how absurd it all was.
"Nothing more than I told you already. It will come in time,"
Hannibal said, reaching a junction in the road and flipping the lights on, becoming just another vehicle unremarked on the street.
"Memory loss is an aspect of aging."
Will eyed him, wondering if he was supposed to be annoyed because he felt annoyed.
"If you're trying to irritate me, not at all. Simply making a point,"
Hannibal assured him, amused by his response.
"However, that being said, I think it is reasonable to believe that you can regain your memories. Tell me what you do remember, Will."
Will heaved a sigh, head lolling to look out the window again, his thoughts turning inwards.
"Tell me about the man you saw in the woods."
"It wasn't a man," Will said, thinking of the ravenstag on the offensive, ready to gore him for his intrusion.
"Why were you out there?"
"To get some peace," Will answered, closing his eyes.
"Is that when he took you, Will?"
"No," he said, thinking of the bed he'd been in, how that man had kissed his palms with the same fierce, breathless intent of a sinner seeking redemption.
"No, it was after. But perhaps this is the first time he saw you, and you him?"
"Might be," Will said, brow furrowing. There was something else there, something important that had followed his rough introduction to the ravenstag of his dreams.
"You made it out of that confrontation intact,"
Hannibal mused.
"However it responded, it let you leave without doing too much damage."
"Yeah, maybe."
Will closed his eyes, finding himself in a heap on the wrong side of that log, caught in a tangle of dried tree branches. The stag was before him, bellowing and rearing, ready to cut him down with its sharp hooves, and pin him with its stretching antlers. How had he managed to escape it? How had he, a freshly minted boy, as Hannibal had said, walked away from that challenge and back home to his family without coming to harm? How had he later found himself in its bed, naked and afraid?
"This relationship you had with your ravenstag,"
Hannibal said, his purring voice finding Will in a world made entirely of broken, dead tree branches and fluttering kisses.
"I find it quite fascinating."
Fascinating. That's what it was. He let me go because he was fascinated with me. It was a meeting by moonlight, unexpected and startling, particularly under the circumstances. Neither expected the other to be there just then, in just the right place, as if fate itself had conspired they meet. Blossoming youth, set in the path of age and experience, how else could things have come about? Because he'd seen him, the face behind the frightening stag. He'd looked straight back at a monster with the wondrous abandon of utter naive innocence, insulated by youth, unaffected by violence he'd never been exposed to, and thus was not afraid of.
What a tempting morsel you must have made.
Hannibal had never once wondered if the ravenstag had been just as tempting in turn. In the darkness behind his eyes, the powerful form moved slowly toward him, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs, his dark eyes alert and leery. The robber lay dying in the dirt, and Will didn't care. He didn't care at all because the robber was a bad man, and bad men deserved whatever nasty end they met.
"Who are you?"
It asked him, tossing its noble head, forelegs dancing restlessly in the thick dead leaves.
"Will?"
he answered, the sum of his life thus far, a simple syllable to encompass the whole.
"Are you frightened, Will?"
The scent of it was warm and wild, tangy blood and rich spices. It looked at him with teeth in its gaze, as if chewing down the side of him and swallowing him up. "No," he said, splayed there in the bracken, in an undignified heap, unmoving in his awe.
"You're so beautiful."
The ravenstag threw back its head, its laughter filling all the world. When Will opened his eyes, it was Hannibal's laughter he heard, throaty and deep, and for an instant it seemed that the stag wore the face of Hannibal Lecter, surprised from his stoic reserve by the blunt, blurted confession of a strange, lonely youth who had never had the sense to be frightened of him.